It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Mauricio Gutiérrez, who is CEO of NRG. NRG is a Fortune 200 company investing in tremendous amount of renewables on the grid, as well as owning a significant amount of thermal generation as well. They also serve 3 million retail customers, and as I said, one of the largest owners of retail power. As the CEO of NRG, I think Mauricio shares some of the same challenges we do as we try to anticipate this future grid, how it will come together, what investments need to be made, and where they need to be made. So he has a significant challenge. When we talked about what Mauricio should talk about, I told him a couple of things. I said, one, I think you play a critical role in decarbonizing the grid, and your assets are absolutely fundamental to that. And I also said, we talk a lot about 50% RPS in California. That means there's the other 50%. And I think we need to be mindful of that other 50% to maintain reliability and hold down costs and make sure the grid all comes together. And I think they're even going to be more important as we move beyond 50%. So with that as context, I'm delighted to introduce Mauricio Gutiérrez of NRG.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon. It's great to be here with all of you today. And Steve, thank you for that opening act. I don't know how to follow the Governor Brown. So before I start, I just want to recognize and thank Governor Brown for his leadership in the fight against climate change. I think he has laid out the specific goals and the path that we need to do to be able to achieve the decarbonization of the economy. And I'm hoping that in this symposium, we have an opportunity to talk about some of the specific challenges that we have, to be able to achieve those goals. I also will be remiss if I don't recognize Steve. I think we all, you'll agree with me that we have the right person at the helm of the ISO to make the changes to make the necessary changes that we need to be able to achieve these objectives of, creating a cleaner and a more sustainable energy future. I think, perhaps some of you remember NRG as a traditional IPP. So, I just want to take 2 minutes of your time to reintroduce NRG to all of you. And, just like California is going through a massive transformation, NRG is going through its own transformation. We have embraced diversification and integration as key components to be able to navigate through this, massive change that we're seeing in our industry. In terms of integration, we have focused in 2 areas. That's generation and retail. On the generation side, not only the, traditional utility scale power plants, but also distributed resources and renewables. On the retail side, we're working with residential, commercial, and industrial customers to provide them more energy choices. So, as you think about NRG, I think we have been able to diversify our business significantly. And not only it's about the business model that we have been able to embrace, but it's also some of the specific goals that inform every investment decision that we make. A couple of years ago, we announced our sustainability goals. We intend to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2050. And we take this very seriously at the company. So everything that we're doing in terms of strategic decisions, have these sustainability goals around them. So let me start with a quick overview of NRG here in California. And just about 10 years ago, we were a niche player in California. We have under 1,000 megawatts of generation, traditional generation, and We didn't even participate directly in the California markets. We actually participated through a joint venture with one of our competitors. Today, we're the largest generator in California with, a little over 10,000 megawatts of generation. A very diversified portfolio, from the large, old steamers that still provide a lot of reliability, particularly in the coastal areas, to the new, efficient, quick start, combined cycle, and combustion turbine gas units that allows us to integrate the renewables, to a very thriving renewable business, which today makes almost 20% of our total generation in the state. So, as you can see, I think of California, where we want to be as a company, in the next couple of years. We're embracing reliability, we're embracing some of the traditional generation, but we know that we have to be also committed, to continue building, the resources that we need, to have a more cleaner energy future. Sometimes it's often lost that we're also in the district energy business. So here in California, we provide steam and chilled water to San Diego and San Francisco. And not only our portfolio is pretty large today, but we are committed to continue investing in California in some of the new resources. We refer to them as preferred resources here, distributed resources. But think of demand response, backup generation, distributed solar. All of these new resources that we need that are very flexible and that will allow us to integrate the renewables, we are committed to it. So, some of the remarks and observations that I will make today, I think come from a vantage point of a company that is involved in many aspects of our industry, not just in the traditional utility, scale, but also in the distributed resources. And I'm sure that all of you read the news that Apple was going to vertically integrate and become their own energy supplier. So, the way we think about it, for every Apple, there is 100 companies that may not have the scale, but want to have access to these distributed resources. So we believe that being in this area is critical, to continue to be consistent with, some of the changes that we're seeing with our business partners. They want to take more control in how they generate their electricity and where, and this is critical for the continued growth of our company. So if I have to summarize the energy policy of California in one word, I would say is decarbonization. Decarbonization of the economy, decarbonization of the grid. Every single policy that we have seen is geared towards that goal, whether it is, a renewable portfolio standard, 33% by 2020, 50% now by 2030, the electrification of the transportation sector, 1.5 million electric vehicles, the introduction of battery storage, and now the latest, which is reducing greenhouse emissions by 40% under the 1990 levels. So all of them are aimed to decarbonizing the grid. But as an industry, we have two other goals that are equally important and perhaps get a little less attention by the media and even by our own presentations. And that is affordability and reliability. I think everybody understands the reliability. We design our grid having that in mind. It is one of the great characteristics that our industry has been able to provide to this society. Not everybody in the world enjoys a 99.99999% reliability. That is a one curtailment event every 10 years. So we need to make sure that as we are introducing these decarbonization goals, we keep the reliability of the system, in mind. And the second one is the affordability. We need to make sure that we create a system that is not only built for the haves, but also for the have-nots. And some of the technologies today are not cost efficient. We need to talk about it. We need to create the right framework to be able to make them cost efficient. But we have to recognize that some of them are just not ready, and that we will need other technologies to help as a bridge to achieve that low carbon economy that we want. So, these energy policies, from my perspective, can be summarized or can be implemented through 4 key products here in California. And the careful balance of these products is going to, is going to allow us to see the success of these policies. The first one is renewables. Everything is going to be, is going to revolve around renewables. And but we know that this is a variable generation. It's an intermittent generation. The sun doesn't shine always, and the wind doesn't blow. So we need to have some other form of generation that fills those gaps. And that form of generation is natural gas and battery storage. From my perspective, a little bit more natural gas today and a little bit more storage tomorrow. And we just need to make sure that we have that correct bridge. The other one is controllable demand. How do we integrate a lot of these distributed resources with the grid? Whether it is demand response, distributed solar, everything, all the technologies behind the meter. We need to make sure that we have the right protocols and the right framework to be able to make it seamless. So, for some of my colleagues that know me, I'm big on scorecards, and how are we stacking up against those four products? And I think the renewables get the high watermark. We've been very successful in terms of developing and building renewables, both wind and solar, in the state, close to 17 gigawatts of generation. I think one of the key characteristics or the key components of this success has been the competitive procurement process. And this is the right framework that allowed us to really bring a lot of the cost and the innovation down on renewables. And similar, to this competitive procurement process that we have for renewables, we need to start thinking about that in the context of battery storage and other distributed resources. Storage and controllable demand are nascent. We have, I think the verdict is still out there. We have very specific goals, and we need to make sure that we just continue to have the right framework. So let me talk about flexible gas. And here, it's the competitive process actually has been quite successful. We have added a significant amount of gas generation, flexible gas generation. But keep in mind that not all generation gets their revenue the same way. Some of them are contracted, some of them are merchant. And one of my concerns is, are we providing the right incentives to existing generation, particularly the ones that we're going to need as we integrate these renewables in the future. So one is adequate compensation, and the second one is it takes a long time to build a power plant here in California. And we are seeing that being exacerbated even more with uncertainty around litigation. So we need to keep in mind that there are very real hurdles to be able to bring some of these generation online. So let me expand a little bit on this, and if you allow me just to get into numbers. Over the past couple of years, both the competitive procurement process have been able to bring about 12 gigawatts of new generation between gas and renewables. We have retired about 7 gigs. So net, we have a pretty good surplus. If you look at the reserve margin in the state, we're close to 30%. We have an oversupply situation right now in the state, and most of it is being driven by the competitive procurement process that we've had. If you look at on the right-hand side, I broke down where do we get the energy from, and most of the folks always talk about total energy, megawatt hours. I think if you ask anybody, how do we in California, bring our energy from, most of the people will say 25% comes from imports, About 20% comes from renewables, which is growing, and it's going to be 33% in a couple of years, and then 50%. And then the rest comes from thermal, nuclear, and hydro. But when we think about the reliability of the system, we actually think about it in a slightly different way. We need to look at that resource mix, not on an average basis, but particularly on the peak hours or the peak days. And this is where it changes, the story changes a little bit more. I mean, if you look at the bar, the green part is the thermal generation. I mean, that goes from just shy of 40% to close to 60% of thermal generation during those peak hours. So we've gotten really good at predicting renewables, whether it's wind and solar. I think there's been a significant amount of innovation and accuracy on that, but it's not perfect. Sometimes we don't know how many imports are going to come into the state. Sometimes we don't know how renewables is going to respond. And then, we have, situations where that derates our ability to bring power in the states. I mean, we've had a number of wildfires, sometimes surrounding coastal areas. And you all know when that happens, transmission lines get derated, and you count on generation that is in the coastal areas, because we cannot compromise, access to our service. It is so important to our society today that we cannot compromise reliability. So, now that, we touched a little bit in this, in this massive, turnover of our resources from nuclear and gas steamers to renewables and flexible gas, how are we stacking up with our goal of decarbonizing the economy? Here is a representation of both state, total state greenhouse emissions and the power sector. I think if you look at it with our 2020 level, we're well on our way. We have reduced greenhouse emissions by about 5%. Given the new target that we have to reduce it 40% from the 1990 levels, we have a lot of work to do. On the right-hand side, I put the power contribution to that reduction in emissions. And, I think we've done, our fair share. I mean, almost 3 times on a relative basis, with the state. So just to put it in context, I mean, the power sector produces about 20% of greenhouse emissions. So when we think about, trying to, to achieve that 2030 target, it cannot come all from the power industry. We're going to do our part, and we already talked about, increasing and upping the ante in terms of renewable generation. But 40% of those emissions comes from the transportation sector. And if we really want to get to this, 40% below the 1990 level, we have to tackle the electrification of the transportation sector. And to me, that's going to be the big challenge. How do we do that? How do we integrate, that distributed resource, into our system? Because that is going to be critical for us to be successful and be able to achieve, these goals. So, so far it's been the feel-good part of my presentation. Everything is working well. We're on our way to achieve carbon targets. We have been able to add, a surplus in terms of generation. But the reality is there are enormous challenges ahead of us. And, clearly I just outlined here a few of them. This is not a comprehensive list. And, many of you here in the room actually are participating in stakeholder processes to be able to tackle these challenges. So you may have even more details than I have. But, clearly the revenue adequacy of resources that rely exclusively on the market is questionable. And this is not just gas. This is any resource that is going to participate and rely 100% in the market for the revenues. Clearly the gas-electric coordination, was exacerbated by the Aliso Canyon. We need to talk about it. We need to figure out a better way to, more efficiently, reflect the cost of fuel into the generator bids. I already talked about the long development timelines, and that has been exacerbated by litigation and appeals, that the burden continues to be on the developer. Even with fully permitted plant, it takes just a very, very long time. In terms of the renewable integration, our market needs to evolve to be able to have the right products that will incent and that will send the right price signals to these resources. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. And of course, we have now the curtailment issue. We've been so successful with the penetration of renewables that now we cannot utilize all of them. So, whether it's regionalization or whether it is, a lot more flexible resources to be able to manage this curtailment, it's something that we need to tackle. So in the interest of time, I just want to talk about two of these specific challenges. And so let me start with the compensation on resources that only rely on in the market. And this chart basically gives you a historical view on merchant versus contracted generation. At the beginning of in 2000s, most of our generation was relying on the market. Today, we're actually in a low point of that. Most of the generation is contracted, about 35%. But we need to recognize that these contracts will roll off. And as they roll off, they will be relying in the market to make the right economic decisions, whether it is putting maintenance dollars, to extend the longevity of these assets, whether it is, to retire a plant if it's not needed in the system. So this is not an issue for the existing gas steamers. I think we all take comfort that the gas steamers, are affected by once-through cooling, and sometime, they will retire in the next couple of years. But, today our gas steamers, tomorrow is going to be combined cycle plants, and in the future is going to be battery and renewables that come out of contract. I mean, this is something that we need to, that we need to start tackling today, and we need to make sure that we have an energy market that is robust and is providing the right price signals to all resources and all generators. So how are these resources compensated? This information comes from the California ISO. It's an historical view in terms of all the total energy revenues, energy, ancillary services, and capacity or resource adequacy, as we call it here in California, RA. The RA is a shaded area because there is not a very transparent price. I mean, this is a bilateral contract. It's we put here the average RA price. Some units get a little more, some units get a little less. But as you can tell, since 2008, existing resources, are not earning enough, revenues, with respect to the baseline, which is, the cost of new generation. And actually, I can rationalize that for you. I mean, didn't we say that we had 30% reserve margin? What that means is the market is actually showing us, the right price signal. We need about 15% of generation to leave the market to be able to get down to the 15% reserve margin target that we have. So, as we think about that, we take some comfort of the oversupply situation that we have, driven primarily by these long-term contracts. But there are unintended consequences. Clearly some generation needs to leave the market, but there is some other generation, particularly flexible generation, that is providing integration services for renewables that should not leave the market, and right now at a significant risk of leaving. So let me play a little bit of scenario analysis. So let's talk about the next 10 years. The left-hand chart is a number of additions and retirements. So when you think about the retirements that we're going to have the next 10 years, we already talked about the once-through cooling, close to 11 gigawatts. Diablo Canyon is gonna retire in 24, 25. So that's another 2 gigs. So right there, 13 gigawatts of retirements. On the right-hand side are additions, both natural gas, renewables, and battery storage. And I'm making an assumption here, the battery storage that is consistent with the targets that have been laid out on the policies that we talked about initially. So we're going to have a shortfall, a pretty significant shortfall. And that shortfall is about, that's going to bring the reserve margin from 30% to close to 20%. So I think we'll be okay. Except that, we have this, gas generation that is relying completely in the market that is at risk. We have done our own internal analysis, and we have identified close to 5 gigawatts of generation that is at risk. Well, if this generation leaves the market, then we have a reliability problem, because our reserve margin will go down to single-digit numbers, significantly below the 15% reserve margin required to achieve the level of reliability that we want for the system. So let's keep that in mind. So let me talk about the second big challenge or concern, and that is the integration of renewable generation. And this is the chart that that made Steve famous. The duck chart. I think everybody recognizes this. This was the work of the ISO a few years ago. It basically tried to predict the net load, which is load minus renewables, over a period of time, all the way through 2020. And that red dot is this year. I mean, this is the net load that we had in May 15, just shy of 12,000 megawatts. So my point is, 2020, guys, is here. I mean, we've been so successful on renewable penetration that 2020 is here. And we can't wait for the changes that we need to make to the market to be able to integrate these renewables for 2020. We have to start making the changes now, today. The ramping capacity, last year, it was over 3 hours, we needed 80 megawatts per minute of ramping capacity. So that's pretty significant, and this is what the challenge that we have. A few weeks ago, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory put a paper, and I'm sure that some of you have seen it, in terms of how much batteries or how much battery storage we need to be able to support a 50% renewable penetration. And as I was reading that paper, something was pointed out, which was the minimum generation level that California needs. And they put it at 15,000 megawatts. So just to put this in context, anything below 15,000 megawatts is renewable curtailment. That's how we need to start thinking about it. So it is an issue that we need to tackle. And again, whether it's regionalization or much faster adoption of flexible generation is needed. So I talked about the markets evolving to provide the right price signals, so we're able to incentivize innovation and new resources to provide this ramping capacity, this flexible capacity. So let's look at the price signals that we're getting. And on the left-hand chart, I plotted renewable penetration and total ancillary revenue. And look, I mean, ancillary revenues is not the perfect metric, but it's a good proxy. And when you think about it, this seems a little counterintuitive. As we have increased renewable penetration, one would think that we would send the right price signal so we have more flexible resources. But on the contrary, ancillary revenues have decreased, consistently, over the past 10 years. And this is not strange to the ISO. I mean, they're tackling these front and center. There was a product that was introduced in 2012, the Flexible Ramping Constraint Program. That's on the chart on the right-hand side. I think at the beginning it was It started to provide, some price signals, but, it has some changes with a price cap later. So, this is the price signal that we're providing to innovators and generators to bring, flexible capacity. And is this the right price signal that we want to have? Of course, what exactly is the technology that can provide this flexible capacity? And this is the levelized cost of energy. And I only put these not because I want to see the big contrast between existing gas or combined cycle gas and battery storage, but because we have to create a framework to get battery storage cost down to be competitive with gassy CGTs. Just like we did with renewables, which now today they compete head to head with gas. We need to bring battery storage to that. And what is that framework that we need to have to be able to close that gap? So it's not a matter of, well, I actually do believe that in the time frame that we have and given the renewable penetration, natural gas is the solution, at least in this transition period, while we get battery storage to where we need to have it. So, as someone told me, if you're going to point out issues, you better have some solutions and recommendations. These are our, recommendations. And, I will start by saying that the first one is just to have a robust market system. The benefits of having a robust market system is so critical to the success of decarbonizing the economy. If you think about it, a robust market system, one, allows us to run the system cost effectively. Number two, it incentivizes innovation. And number three, it attracts capital and it doesn't put the burden on utilities and consumers and customers. So it is critical that we have an energy market that works and that works well. I point to things here, a mandatory multi-year forward contracting requirement for resource adequacy. Today it's only a one-year requirement, and I applaud a lot of the utilities that have multi-year contracts, but they're not a requirement. I think it is important that we provide that level of visibility so generators can actually plan and make sure that as they're putting their maintenance programs, they understand whether this asset is going to retire in 1 year, 2 years, or longer if their services are needed. Also, we need to come up with a product that is going to provide meaningful value to the services, to the flexible services, to be able to integrate these renewables. As I showed to you, right now the price signal is far from where it needs to be. The second thing is just to continue improving the existing market design. Having a lot of out of merit runs is never good for the system because we are not providing the right signal to the system operator. The system operator wants to make sure that they make the right economic decision. So every time there is an out of merit, those costs just get socialized. And this is the case also in terms of reflecting the fuel cost in our bids. Perhaps for the baseload units it's not a big issue because you get a day ahead commitment that is pretty clear, and you can actually go and buy gas in the day ahead market. But for some of the resources that are providing ramping capacity or flexible, which is very difficult to know if you're going to need it or not, once it goes into that out of merit, there are constraints around it, and the cost of fuel becomes dated and is not an effective representation of the risk that the generator is taking. Of course, we need to talk about regionalization, and we need to facilitate regionalization, not just to tackle the curtailment problem on renewables, but also to continue achieving economies of scale and cost efficiencies in the system. And then finally, it is the framework that we need to be able to integrate distributed resources. And here, I think that the most challenging one will be, how we're going to integrate a massive electrification of the transportation system. So let me just finalize with a few closing remarks. It's critical that we improve this energy market. More and more our resources will depend on it. And while today it doesn't seem that it's a big issue because some of these steamers will retire anyway, tomorrow is combined cycles, and then the next day is going to be battery storage, and then renewables, the first generation of renewables. We need to develop these products to be able to integrate the renewable generation, but importantly, they have to provide meaningful value to generators so we can actually innovate and bring the cost down of these flexible resources. I think these changes will allow us to be successful in decarbonizing the grid without having to sacrifice reliability and affordability. So thank you.
Mauricio, thank you so much. I think you touched on really important issues, and really to kind of sum it up, I think for us in California and through the Western market, these questions that Mauricio brought up, I think are really important, and we have to show the world how this is done. We're a model, and we need to always keep that in mind, and making sure we get to the heart of these issues to make sure that we have a reliable and dependable system, I think is front and center of what we do. So your remarks are spot on, and we truly appreciate them very much.